We'll be back in a couple of days.
Same Vith. So this is the downtown center of St. Vith. It's Sunday, lunchtime. This is the center of the highways coming into St. Vith. So this would be the road to Vith, Malmedy. From North 62. This is the road to the center of the town. And then we're at Lanzareth. That's Germany over there where the windmills are. That's the town of Lanzareth. There are foxholes in here. So this is the hill that the Germans just kept coming up. This is pointed toward the hill, towards Lanzareth.
The foxhole is occupied by a young man named Lyle Bauk, who commanded an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Division. Again, they'd seen a little bit of minor combat before they got up here, but they were basically untried. Now, there was a gap between the 99th Division and the 106th Division. The only thing in the gap was, like I've been saying, the 14th Cavalry Group. And before the offensive, there were some TDs from tank destroyers from the cavalry group down in the village. And because this was such an important section of the line, Bauk had originally been sent here to just run patrols between the two divisions to make sure he covered the gap in the line. But then because of how thinly spread these guys were, he was told to come here, which was technically 106th Division territory, so he's out of his AO, area of operations, and occupy this ground. there have been foxholes here previously, and he went into these foxholes, reinforced them with logs overhead. The woods look pretty much the same as they did then, because through here they farm a lot of the trees, so you're not going to get massive big trees like you might be thinking of. This is about the size they would have been. Because from this point here, he can control the road that we were just on, and that's the direction of the German advance. Of course, it's going to be wintertime, so the foliage is going to be down. And he's going to be in position here at about 5:30 in the morning on the 16th when the barrage starts. Hour-and-a-half barrage is going to land all along the line here. He's got 18 men, so odds and sods maybe up to 20. But because he's been in position here, and he's an INR platoon, they've got some 50 calibers, they've got a lot of machine guns, they pulled off of jeeps, and they're going to have interlocking fields of fire on this field here, and they're just guarding that road. And again, no foliage, so they can see right down to the road. And he's placed his guns perfectly. And because he's taken the time to prepare his position, his men don't suffer during that barrage. But what does happen is the 14th Cavalry Group falls apart almost immediately, and they just start streaming back. And in the process of that, those tank destroyers pull out. So he's now solo. Okay? And soon after the barrage lifts, he can see Germans down in the village below. He can tell from their helmets that they're Fallschirmjägers. There was a Fallschirmjäger regiment that was coming here initially because they're going to try to clear out any infantry opposition that's going to get in the way of the tanks, to give the tanks a way to get through. Because if you're a tank commander, the last thing on earth you want to do is send vehicles into a town if you don't have infantrymen there, because they'll get knocked out, and that's what happens where we're going to go next. So they're going to send infantry up first. He lets the head of the column pass through, and he's going to open fire on all the Germans when a girl comes out and points in the direction of the hillside to some Germans. Now, in a lot of the books, she's called, a collaborator, or she ratted him out. There have been subsequent interviews that have said, she didn't even know Bulge was up here. She knew that there were Americans down there, and that when they pulled out, the Germans said, well, where are the Amis, the Americans? And she was pointing in the directions that the tank destroyers had taken off on. She wasn't revealing his position. So right as he's about to fire, he orders his men to hold their fire because he's not going to shoot the girl. The Germans now are going to start thinking that there's something up here, and about that time, they're going to open fire. And the Germans are going to launch frontal waves attacks up the hill. But they're going to hold the position. 18 to 20 guys against a whole regiment of German paratroopers.
How many's in a regiment?
Well, then you probably have upwards of 900 or so.
Wow.
3 attacks, and they said it was just like you'd imagine the Pacific Theater. They just started advancing across the field, and every time they would hit one of these wire fences, it'd slow them up. Because you can't just run across the fence, and they cut them down. And by the time they're done, that field is going to be covered with German dead. And I've heard various numbers of casualties, but in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 killed and wounded over the course of that day. Now, during the initial barrage, all of Bulge's communications with anybody have been cut, so he's here by himself. He holds them. At one point during the fight, he tries to get runners back to say, hey, what do we do? It doesn't get through. He finally gets word that he's going to be able to pull out. But at that time, the Germans, after losing, God knows how many hundred, they're going to flank the position. They're going to come in from this side, and they're going to break into his position. because he's got no support on either side. And they're going to start rolling him up, and Bauke's going to get captured and taken down into the town. And he is going to delay the advance in this area. He's going to throw Piper off schedule by 18 hours. When time is of the essence, Piper's already badly behind schedule. About midnight, Bauke is down there with his guys, and the German paratroopers are all laying around a cafe, and when we go down, I can point it out to you. And in walks Piper, and he's ballistic. And he goes up to the German officer who's in charge, who, by the way, outranks him. He says, you know what the hell's going on here? He says, well, there's a whole battalion of Americans in the trees, and I can't get them out of there, so tomorrow morning I'm going to make a big push. And Piper kind of breaks bad on the German officer. He mounts some paratroopers on his tanks, and then by about 4 in the morning they're going to keep pushing on. But it's a terrific example of just sheer guts. Ironically, it's Bauke's 21st birthday, so he celebrates his 21st birthday.
What rank?
He's 10th. And there's a book now about the stand here. Kershaw says it's the most decorated platoon in the Army, and I'm not going to get into that, but they do a magnificent job.
How many of them survive?
There was one, most of them survived. And they get the nickname of, they call the division the Battle Babies after the fight here. But they're going to be a whole list of leadership characteristics that Don and I have kind of hit upon, and you'll see it when we hand out the books tonight. You'll get your maps. But the one here is courage, and it's easy to say that, but if you think of what this guy was facing, he was all alone with 18 men, and the entire German army, in his mind, is coming down that road. And he says, you know, boys, we're staying right here.
You know the tanks had to stay on the roads, and you said they were hard surface roads. When they get to a skirmish area, could they break out?
They could. No, they could, but not, you know, you could send a few tanks across that field, but the tanks at this point, there's a traffic jam that goes all the way back to the German border. You know, it's not like you have tanks mixed in amongst the infantrymen. The idea being that the Fallschirmjäger are going to come up here and they're going to clear out anything that's in the way. And the tanks will be able to come up for some kind of a big attack. But when that regiment hits, they're not going to have the armored support. And the German commander rationalizes, well, in the morning we'll bring up more stuff, and then we'll push this American battalion off the hill.
And how far would the 18 men stretch down? Another 100 yards?
Chris, you talked about ammunition. How well supplied were they in terms of stuff?
They were very well supplied. They'd been in here for a while. Like a lot of these units, they've done a very good job of scrounging extra stuff. INR platoons, probably more so than a regular rifle platoon. They'd have a lot more mobility. They'd operate on their own a lot more. And I haven't spoken to anybody in this platoon, but other guys in other INR platoons I've talked to said, we loaded down our Jeeps with anything that'd go bang. Because, you know, what they would do with these guys, what they're supposed to do with them, is as your unit advances, you send them out front to see where the bad guys are. So they're used to running into situations where they might need a little bit more oomph. So they had the ammunition they needed.
What about
running
landmines?
out.
What about landmines?
They had machine guns and some mortars too.
Did they have artillery observers with us for a while?
But that's a good point. But they had artillery observers for a while, but they don't have the communication to call down the fire. And also, this attack is so big that they can't provide fire support everywhere they need to provide fire support. Because there are fire control officers back at headquarters getting about 1,000 requests, like, you know. And so the guy at the other end, even if he had gotten the message, he would have said, okay, great, I'll put you on your list. You know. So for all the whiz-bang stuff we have, it's really...
Well, they primarily moving this way, coming this way, up the road.
But then they attack right across the field.
Were all phones at that time wired?
or did they have wire?
No, well, they use hand crank phones. Why? That's what John did. And when we get to Bastogne, John can talk about laying wire. You didn't have any cell phones then, right, John?
They had sound power too, phones.
Yeah.
They carried them between platoons.
Right. But the radios, I know you guys didn't.
Today's one which, pardon my expression, I wouldn't put shit.
Right.
They wouldn't carry, you get in the woods, you're talking about the walkie-talkies.
Yeah.
They wouldn't carry it. You get into something like this,
So
the best communication back then really, not without the wire, but it was fire.
We're in the twin villages of Krinkelt, Rocherath, or Rockerath.
how are we doing now? We doing
Grass looks good, yeah.
what?
What else you got down there? The grass looks good.
Okay, you can't get the bus all the way into the woods, but if you can see the tree line down there, you'll see where it gets dark in the front. There's a little gorge there. Right down there, there was another platoon of infantrymen commanded by a guy named Goffingen, who was from Virginia, West Point grad. He was 22. He had an infantry platoon, and he had a platoon in the 9th Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Division. And he had been assigned to a regiment of the 99th Division, because up those woods, the woods extended more to the left. It was all covered over. Elements of the 99th Division are trying to fight their way out, because remember we drove by that town called Wallerscheid. They were down there, and as the Germans start to expand, you have elements of 2 divisions, 2nd and 99th, that are cut off. 6 battalions. They're going to get cut off, and they have to do a fighting withdrawal back through the woods, and eventually come into the twin villages, and then keep going through, and behind is Elsenborn Ridge. And you remember, you might have heard me say that that's where they were going to set up the 2nd line of defense after Skyline Drive, and that position fell. I heard about that. So what happens is the Germans are starting to close this pocket of guys, and they leave the platoon of the 9th Regiment down there, this guy named Goffingen, and they say, you've got to hold this road until everybody gets out. We've got 18 guys. Because they've been rushed up here from St. Vith, they have only their basic load of ammunition, which means they have what's in their Garand belt. So that's 80 rounds? 80 rounds. They've got no food, they've got no heavy weapons, nothing. They get up there, there are 2 tanks from the 741st Tank Regiment there, and that's all he's got. And he's seeing all these guys from these 2 divisions streaming down this road, and they tell him, you've got to hold. On the 17th, a bunch of guys pass through, and he can look, and down where the trees get dark, where it gets dark, there's a gorge there, and he can look down and he can see 2 battalions of SS infantry from the 12th SS getting ready to attack. Behind them, he can see tanks, Panther tanks. The Germans are going to launch 3 attacks, and they're going to hold them off for 3 attacks. He's calling for artillery support, and he can't get any. To his right, there are 2 other companies of that regiment. One of them is commanded by Charles McDonald, who you may have heard company commander. He's to the right in the woods, further down. And McDonald is calling back saying, I've got to have artillery, I've got to have tanks. And they say, sorry, can't help you. He said, well, there are 2 tanks there were these 2 Sherman tanks that pulled out, use them. And he's told, well, they're not going to do much good against Panther, so no. So they leave them there. And they leave them there for the better part of the day. Goffingen and his radio man are the only 2 men that make it out. But while they're standing in place and dying down there, an officer by the name of McKinley, who's got a battalion of guys, is going to set up positions further up this road. And the Germans are going to start launching tank and infantry attacks through the 17th and the 18th. At one point, 3 Panther tanks come up the road, and the Americans here in the village don't know whether they're German tanks or they're more Americans somehow trying to get out of the pocket. And they pass right by Company B, and they realize they're Germans, and there's this great story of these 2 GIs standing on the side of the road, and pardon my gesture, but the Germans are all in the tank going. As they drive into town, and they make a right, and they get behind Company A. Company A drops mortar fire on, lights up one of the tanks, which lights up the area. The Germans can realize they're now behind American lines. The Americans realize the Germans are behind American lines, and they start having a gunfight in town. The tanks actually start running over the top of the foxholes of the A Company guys and grinding them up. But the town is going to be fought back and forth. The Germans are going to infiltrate tanks and Panzer Grenadiers, mostly from the 12th SS, in through this town, and for 2 days they're going to fight for control of the town. They hold the road open enough for everybody to get out of the pocket, and then what's left of McKinley's battalion, he starts off the fight here in the town with 600 men, and less than 48 hours later he's got 270 left that go back to Elsenborn Ridge. And these guys had been in combat before the German offensive even started. They've been fighting in the Siegfried line, and they had started to come back. And since they were the first guys to start leaving that area, American officers here said, well, you just hold this town while everybody else gets out. So they were in constant combat. But I just give you a quick statistics. Let me see here. They're going to account for, here we go. The Germans are going to start the attacks on that first roadblock here at positions on either side of the road with 105 tanks. And McKinley and Goffingen are going to account for 100 of them, 107 of them. And they have no idea of the amount of German infantry casualties, but they're well into the thousands. The fighting in here gets so bad, what happens is, as they start to approach the lines, the GIs will get down in their holes, the tanks will right over top of them, the GIs will get up, they'll drive off the Panzer Grenadiers, and the tanks are stuck here in town all by themselves. And then teams of bazooka men will just stalk in the town, and they'll stalk the tanks up and down the streets, and they take them out with bazookas. There's one very famous account of an American sergeant right by the church, in the building across the street from the church. There's a German tank there, and he pours kerosene over the top of the tank and starts throwing matches down on it until he lights up the tank. So it's all hand-to-hand bayonet fighting. But for 2 more days they're going to hold this area. So now you've lost upwards of 3 days, and you haven't even achieved your first day's objectives. And again, there's no real, I mean, you know, Eisenhower's not back there saying, all right, I want these men here and these men here and these men here. It's 22-year-olds, 20-year-olds. McKinley is 24. He's been shot, he got shot in the stomach twice in Normandy. He continues to lead his battalion. Was finally evacuated after the campaign, and had only just come back in September.
24-year-old battalion commander.
24-year-old battalion commander. But if you can imagine, if you've seen the movie Stalingrad, it's like that. You know, the Germans are in one house, the Americans are in the other. They're firing on top of buildings. As the Americans are coming out of the pocket, they're literally spraying the woods on the other side of the road there at the end to try to keep the Germans off the vehicles, which is how close it gets. But the battalion, of course, is destroyed. So they're going to get back to Elsenborn Ridge, and they're pretty much done. But they do their job.
So Chris, this is the 6th Panzer.
This is 6th Panzer Army. 1st SS Panzer Corps. In your sheet that you'll get tonight, there's a breakdown of the whole German order battle. And it's 1st SS Panzer Corps, but the guys that are most heavily involved here is 12th SS.
And you got Piper crossing south of here. So this is kind of a northern
Right.
arm that's coming.
Piper's only part of the whole 6th SS Panzer Army, so Piper's the point of the triangle. The stuff that they're hitting us on either side of this. Because Piper's job, you'll see when he hits opposition, he doesn't really try to take it out. He tries to go around it, which is how he starts going off on all these wacky side roads and looking for bridges and stuff. And everybody coming behind him is supposed to clean up the mess. And they get the clocks clean. So pretty much what happens, within 2 or 3 days of the attack getting underway, the idea of having 6th Panzer Army race to the Meuse completely falls apart. And 5th Army is starting to make more progress. 16, 17, 18, and then on the 19th, their friends from the 101st get up to Bastogne.
Just out of curiosity, where's Dietrich through this whole thing, Sepp Dietrich? He stays back in a command post somewhere.
And there are lots of accounts of German officers. Von der Heide, who some of you might remember from Normandy, is actually drops not too far from here. And one of the most stupid, I mean, they tell Von der Heide he's going to drop paratroopers back and Dietrich is going to reach them. None of the guys that fly the transport craft have ever dropped paratroopers before. Paratroopers have never made a jump before. The list just goes on, and these paratroopers just get spread all, everywhere. He eventually gets captured, but he's trying to get back to Dietrich saying, so what's going on? What are we doing? And Dietrich says, well, just don't worry about it, we'll get there. We'll do it.
Chris,
There's no...
at the end of the war, the Germans were willing to sacrifice thousands of people through here to get through. They didn't fight that way at the start, did they? Because they simply overwhelmed people because of their being fast and unprepared armies.
Yeah, I mean, one of the theories about the German army, or one of the discussions about the German army, is most people tend to think they got better, but a lot of people looking at it now say that the German army actually had started to degenerate in about from 42 on. So they tried to make up for it with tanks and machine guns, but they didn't have, they'd lost all their good junior officers. They'd lost the training, they'd lost the discipline. And also, remember too, from June 44 on, every officer in the Wehrmacht thinks that someday he's going to get a knock on the door and get implicated in the plot. So, when they get orders, it's almost like they become the Russians at the beginning. When they get orders to take a town, if it doesn't, at first it doesn't succeed, you just start launching attacks. There's another great account, again, that building right across from the church up there, to give you an idea of the intensity. There were 3 German tanks in the middle of the street. There's nothing at all that the Americans have that can knock it out. And a guy from headquarters, a GI, picks up a .30 caliber off his tripod and stands in the middle of the street and just starts spraying these tanks, which stops them long enough because the German tank drivers are like, what the heck? And then the guys come behind the tanks and knock out 2 of the tanks. But that's the kind of thing that's going on here. And again,
To knock out a tank, if you simply knock a tread off, it's out of action, it can't go anywhere. It still has its cannon and machine
in fact,
guns.
There are American tanks from that tank battalion, 741st, some of them are back in here. There are a number of tanks that have been knocked out, well, disabled, but their guns still operate and the crews stay in the tanks and take out Panthers as they're going up and down the streets.
So if you could do that to a Panther tank, though, he was out of the war.
Because if you stop a Panther tank, they've already gotten all the supporting infantry away. They're gone. So you've got a tank crew buttoned up inside the tank, so they can either stay there and get surrounded, or they try to get out, and then they just get killed. Whereas if an American tank gets knocked out, there are other infantrymen around, so there's a chance for them to infiltrate back into the tank, or use it, or do something with it. But for the Germans, they can't.
When did they bring the bazookas in?
The infantry units have bazookas. It was just here with the infantry that were here.
Right, so why didn't they use the bazookas against the tanks?
They did.
Mm-hmm.
But you said they had nothing.
Stand in front of it. Could you move the tank over? Car coming.
Still, why don't we do it from the side, because it's just harsh.
Okay, everybody, this is a Panther tank. So all the tanks that we were talking about yesterday that were launching those attacks against the twin villages, this is what the guys are up against. The symbol on the front of the tank is for the 1st SS Panzer Division. So that's Dietrich's old command, Piper's command. This is one of Piper's Panther tanks. They found it in the woods nearby and they dragged it here because it makes a nice monument. There's another one at Clairvaux that you'll see. It's in a little bit better shape. But just a couple things about this tank. You'll notice the slope sides of the armor. Part of the reason that the bazookas and the smaller caliber guns had such a hard time with it is the sloped armor, so when a round hits it, it'll shoot off like this, and you'll see that on the King Tiger later today. This was copied from the Russian T-34 tank. When the Germans went into Russia, they were getting their clocks cleaned by T-34s, and they immediately started development on a tank that could stop it, and this is what resulted. You'll notice, if you look at Sherman's, the treads are a lot narrower. The treads on this are very wide, so they're better cross-country. A high-velocity gun. It's got a much greater range than a Sherman tank, so these guys can start killing the Sherman gunners a lot sooner than the Shermans can strike back. They started out with high-velocity 75s, and then eventually they started outgunning them. There are going to be some of these on the way into Bastogne that actually had the early examples of infrared. When we talk about the Panzer Lehr division coming into Bastogne, this is what they're driving. So this is a far superior weapon. And when we talk about Piper's command today, these are the tanks that he has out in front of the column. The King Tigers are further back. But all the attacks at the twin villages yesterday and where we're going to go today on Elsenborn and Dom Buchtenbach, these are the things they're going up against. And the primary anti-tank weapon of an infantry unit is a 57mm gun, which is even smaller than the 76 that's on a Sherman. Absolutely. I'll show you one instance today where a 57mm gun actually got one of these in the front and knocked it out. It's like big news. Either today or tomorrow will give him a chance to tell his story, which is pretty remarkable. They have their old friends and they're kind of playing catch up here. So, we're starting now.
This is in Bulligan.
Yesterday, when we were briefly in Germany, down by Losheim, Piper's going to cross there, this direction. And the first town he's going to hit is Hansfeld. When he gets into Hansfeld, and there's an S-curve where the tanks have to go through. And now you saw the Panther, 15-mile-long column. And he gets into Hansfeld, and he runs into an American anti-tank unit. And there's a brief exchange of fire, but the column is on these guys very, very quickly. And almost immediately they start roasting Americans out and shooting them. Right at the S-curve, they're going to drag 8 guys out, they're going to shoot them there. They're going to go further down, they're going to shoot, they get 5 more guys out to come and surrender under the white flag. They shoot 4, they shoot the 5th in the leg and he drops and they run over him with the tank. Okay, and they're going to kill 30 or 40 Americans in that town. And they're going to start, the few Americans that get out of the town are going to start sweeping back in this direction. We're in Bullingen now, where Andre lives. And right here is a fuel depot, a small fuel depot. So Piper's going to stop his tanks and fuel them up. Now there are conflicting stories about what happens here. Some people say that no Americans were killed here, but several others say that some of the Americans that they had, they'd fill up all the tanks, and then after the tanks had been filled up, they took the guys off and they shot them. The one other thing about this area here is this is all German speaking, and there were guys lined up on the street. This is the rear area for the Losheim Gap at the start of the offensive, and they're getting breakfast, and the tanks just start coming down the road, and they catch them at breakfast, and they're diving down into the cellars. And in a house that was right here by the crossroads, they said this old Belgian came out and he had a Nazi armband on and a burp gun. And he was doing the Heil Hitler salute to all the tanks that drove by. And then they said he was talking to a man in a light-colored coat. Well, Piper had this, like a Luftwaffe jacket or something that he got, and it was different than all the others. And he talked to him, and he was pointing out where all the Americans had sought shelter. So he's going to pass through Bulge. There's going to be a slight delay, but he's going to get more fuel here. But his column is stretched out because I remember when we were back yesterday, Lyle Bout and Brinkelt and Rocherath, the tail end of his column is getting hung up in the traffic jam that stretches back this way and the stand by those guys up there. So he's starting to lose time. So he's going to exit about 18, 19 hours by the time he gets up here. He's going to go through the town and head towards Malmedy and Bognet's Crossroads. I know you saw a lot of these towns as we were driving up Pont Stavelot. That's the direction we're going to be going, but I wanted to explain it all in sequence. But before we get up there, we're going to make a detour, and we're going to go up to Elsenborn, and then we're going to go to a place called Dom Buchenbach. Because what's going to happen, I keep saying northern shoulder and southern shoulder, when the front breaks through, particularly up north, they're going to kick them off of Skyline Drive, and they're going to start pushing them back this way. And as they fight back, the Americans are trying to throw units up on line to form a northern shoulder to funnel the penetration. So the next fight after Brinkelt and Rocherath and Lanzerath is going to be up on Elsenborn Ridge. So we'll take a detour before we get back on the Piper route. We'll go up to Elsenborn Ridge, we'll go to Elsenborn, and then we're going to go to Dom Buchenbach. The monument we passed down there is to the 1st Infantry Division. Big, tall, phallic symbol with it there. That monument is the same monument the 1st Division puts up everywhere. So if you're in some little town in Germany and you see one of those, it's the 1st Division monument. Same monument they had for World War I. But that back down there, I want to talk about a fight, and that's the one instance where a 57mm cannon actually knocks out a Panther. It's a pretty remarkable story. So we'll go to Elsenborn, make a slight detour, do Buchenbach, and then we'll get back down on the road to Malmedy. But as the column is in here in Bulge, and while it's stopped for refueling, there are reports coming now that the Germans have broken through and the tanks have gotten through. And there are fighter bomber squadrons, P-47s, in the area, and they actually start hitting the tail end of Piper's column. And he's going to lose about 30 vehicles between Losheim and Hansfeld. And there's a little air battle there. The Me-109s actually make an appearance, and they shoot down 7 of them. So Piper's going to start losing vehicles all the way right from the get-go. When he crossed at Losheim, the traffic jam was so bad, and to give you an idea of Piper, and kind of why we say decisiveness, he's backed up at the tail end of his traffic jam, and he's fuming. So he just takes his tank and says, I'll ford the river. He just breaks out of the traffic jam and crashes his tank down the riverbank and gets it up on the other side. He couldn't do that with his whole column because it wasn't spread out, but he was so angry that he couldn't go. The other thing is that, like I said, all of these guys are assigned specific routes that they have to take, and Hitler says if any commander breaks his route of advance, he will be executed. Piper completely disregards it, and you're going to see him shimmying all over the place, going into other units' line of advance, which of course gets him going, but that creates more traffic back in this for the fight here. So the traffic jam just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And then Piper fights almost his own little battle. You know, he'll go through a town, and then behind it there'll be more fighting going on, or the rest of the army comes out. So Piper is almost an entirely separate chapter of the whole Bulge. He fights his own separate battle. And another thing I like to mention here, everybody's heard about the Germans dressed in American uniforms. That was Otto Skorzeny. He was Hitler's favorite. They call him Hitler's Commando. He wrote a book called The Most Dangerous Man in Europe. Before the offensive starts, Hitler was very infatuated with Scorzani. He had rescued Mussolini. He captured the Romanian and Hungarian royal family. He'd done all these stealthy command raids. He said, you're going to recruit this body of men. We're going to send them out ahead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, change signs, blow up bridges, seize bridges, all this sorts of stuff. And the word goes out that any German commander that has English-speaking soldiers, preferably with experience in America, should have them report to Scorzani. So what happens is, like in all militaries everywhere, when Obersturmbannführer Sadler gets the order that Scorzani needs the men to find the biggest screw-ups, and you send them to Scorzani. And so the force isn't what it's supposed to be. The other thing is that most of the uniforms that these guys are wearing have been captured from the Americans in '42 at Kasserine. So they're all summer weight cotton fatigue uniforms. And the Americans quickly realized, there's a rumor that they're out there, but they quickly figure out if you see guys in summer weight uniforms, the other thing they notice is if there are 4 men in a Jeep, they're German. Because the Germans say, hey, there are 4 seats in a Jeep, you get 4 minutes. As the vets will tell you, you never put 4 men in a Jeep. It's kind of like stuffing guys into a Volkswagen Beetle. They're everywhere. So these little things start tipping them off. And for the most part, as a unit, they're not effective. But the rumors that they create are, and you'll be all the way down in Stone, and even as far south as Luxembourg City, they're like, hey, there are Germans dressed like Americans out there. And everybody gets really, really jumpy. At Stavelot, I'll show you one spot where they actually do succeed in doing something. But for the most part, they don't work. And again, to kind of show you how screwed up the Germans are, these guys are supposed to be the screen in front of the most important drive in the offensive. And Dietrich has no control over Scorzani. Piper has no contact with Scorzani. These guys are all fighting their own separate little missions. There's no coordination whatsoever. And you contrast that with Eisenhower, who as early as the 17th, even with everybody saying the sky is falling, he's very methodical about saying, get the guys in the airborne up there, get guys from 7th, from 10th Armored up to Gaston, get guys from 7th Armored down. He's trying to slowly restore the situation and get some control over something which is completely chaotic. Whereas the Germans, they have this plan, they go in, and there's just no oversight at all. Modal's not really back there saying, hey, we've hit a wall here at the Leshon Gap, so we're going to go over here, or let's coordinate this offensive. They just send them off the line. And so pretty quickly, it's going to start slowing down. A good portion of the Battle of the Ardennes is going to be decided really in the first couple of days. And it's because the Germans they don't have it today. But anyway, I just want to stop here and say this is like where this fuel dump this year. We got this fuel dump. The massacres are going to start back at Hansfeld, maybe here, but then the next stop on the hit is Malmedy, Bogdan's Crossroads outside of Malmedy. And by the time he gets there, Piper is furious, the subordinates are furious, and the men all know they're falling behind schedule. And all of a sudden, they capture all these Americans. So what are they going to do? So we'll get down and I'll tell you what happens. But we just started here, like I said, we'll make a brief stop before the moving back to Nelson Boy, down to the northern shoulder.